So it appears that the government of Canada is collapsing. Or at least when I say that the mandate of Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, is. And now, even to the point that I'm talking about this, there has been talks, or at least jokes, and I'm saying this, jokes, of Canada going and joining the United States. Wow. My friends, the events that we're going to be talking about here today are an absolute whirlwind. Something that, as Trump comes to office here in 2025, is going to be arguably a repeat of what it is that we saw from 2016 all the way through 2020. We are in for interesting times, to say the least. And the resignation of Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister of Canada, or at least as the leader of the Liberal Party until a new leader is chosen, which honestly, when we go and describe this, pretty much amounts to the same thing, that is something that took place just this past week in front of the Prime Ministerial residence in Ottawa. For some people that watched this was quite a shock. But for most people that have been paying attention to what has actually been happening in Canada and its cost of living crisis, it is honestly not all that surprising. His fall was triggered by the resignation in December of Chrystia Freeland, his long-serving finance minister and once close confidant, which, once this happened, it was essentially an internal vote within the government of no confidence against him. Very rapidly, it seems, his allies were abandoning him, and her declaration was especially important, considering that it was tied to her concerns about the growing national budget deficit, which has been a recurring problem within Canada, and simultaneously, the oncoming Donald Trump tariffs. That is something that we're going to have to explain here later. But my friends, the events that I'm describing here was merely the straw that broke the camel's back. The fall of Trudeau was something that had already been set in motion some time ago by what have now become familiar complaints that many different citizens and democracies make about their leaders, regardless of whatever their political orientation are, but now in today's day and age has typically become far more common in more left-leaning politicians in the Western world that we saw rise over the previous decade. Namely, the fact that these politicians have a tendency to represent an out-of-touch elite, that they are unresponsive to the economic needs of ordinary people, that they are too sympathetic to outsiders at the cost of the native population, and much more. And now mind you, my friends, when I go and say this, I am not saying that that is true or correct or telling people what it is that they should think. I am only stating a basic description about the undercurrent of dissatisfaction that has been sweeping across the Western world. I've said it before, and I will say it again, I will not inject my own political beliefs into any of these things. The perception that general commodity prices, and in particular housing prices, were crazily out of control, and that the immigration policy that Canada had, which for many years has been a point of pride for many Canadians, was no longer rational, and this is something that doomed Trudeau. Trudeau would tell Canadians in a televised address that although he prides himself on being a fighter, that he has to step aside because of the divisiveness and polarization around his leadership, including inside his own caucus. Saying, and I quote, "This country deserves a real choice in the next election, and it has become clear to me that if I'm having to fight internal battles, I cannot be the best option in that election." At the same time this would happen, Trudeau would also announce that the Governor General would grant his request to shut down the Parliament until March 24th, a move that has created quite a bit of uncertainty, considering that Donald Trump is returning to the White House this January. For context of what it is that I'm referring to, the prorogation of Parliament comes in the face of Trump's threats to impose a 25% tariff on Canadian imports to the US, something that he said that he would do on his first day in the White House on January 20th. Trudeau's announcement of prorogation ends the current parliamentary session, and it stops legislation and committee businesses in their tracks. Nothing more can happen with the Canadian government. The whole idea of this is that it was meant to be a tool, a blunt object to be bashed over the government in order to allow Trudeau's inner circle to regroup, gain time, and hopefully be able to fight back. But, as it stands, his departure is something that is going to leave the Liberals scrambling to try and find a new leader in order to take on Pierre Poilievre, which is Canada's Conservative leader. In a pre-recorded video released on X shortly after Trudeau's announcement, Poilievre would call for an immediate election. At the same time, he accused all Liberal MPs of backing policies that, quote, left the country broken, saying, and I quote, their only objection is that he is no longer popular enough to win an election and keep them in power, end quote. Again, as I said at the opening of this video, for people who have not necessarily been paying attention, this whole thing is quite shocking. Trudeau is just the latest victim in a global series of incumbents who have failed to maintain power. UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, US President Joe Biden, France's Emmanuel Macron, and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz have all faced stiff political losses. And that, my friends, is something that I need to go ahead and take note of here. Considering how busy it is that I have not been able to dive into the sheer amount of government collapses that have been taking part in the last couple of months. But oh dear God, have there been so many. So if at any given point I am posting things that appear to be 1 or 2 months behind, yeah, that is because every single video that I do is an extensive deep dive, and I'm not going to just create a 5 to 10 minute video saying, oh, hey, look, the government collapsed. But on that note, hey, did I talk about some of the issues like in the case of France or Germany before? Yeah, I did. But you cannot blame me for those. They had even more happening already. I did not cause this. I know what people already say in the comment sections. The thing is, though, what I have completely neglected to talk about is the gradual weakening of Canada, a country that for years has been the target of statements such as, oh, if X gets elected, I am moving to Canada. Well, that's probably changing. For years, Canada has been the kind of golden child of the Americas on paper. People oftentimes consider it a great place due to its reputation for being a welcoming, multicultural society with high-quality healthcare, low crime, great education, a strong economy, an absolute beautiful natural landscape, and also being committed to peacekeeping through initiatives like varying different peacekeeping missions and charity, all in an effort to contribute to a high standard of living not only for its own people, but specifically to help people around the world. Canada has a very positive international image, which is a great thing. I am not going to say anything against that. But underneath the global popular good image, the structure of Canada itself has been deteriorating over time, and its population growing more resentful as cost of living crises sweep the country. I know that my editor is going to put up some of these right now while it is that I am speaking, but if you've seen any of those TikTok or YouTube videos that pose the question, oh, Canadian home or literal European castle, which shows just how a rundown shack in Canada will cost as much as an actual castle in Europe, you will know what it is that I am talking about. With time, the quality of life within Canada has gradually been getting worse. And the question is, of course, here on the History of Everything, how exactly did it get this bad? Well, my friends, join me on today's episode as we dive into the story and trouble with America's hat. But my friends, before we get into all that, I wanted to ask you something. Have you ever gone and Googled yourself, a family member, or a loved one and been shocked by just how much personal information was publicly available? Maybe it was just like an old address or a phone number or any other detail that you didn't really expect to find. But the fact that it was there and literally anyone could get their hands on it was a little bit concerning. Well, thankfully, because I'm being sponsored by Aura and I actually use their service, I don't have to worry about that as much anymore. In today's day and age, when we are constantly being connected with new sources of information and plugging in all of our details into different sites, this is something that can go really wrong really fast. And Aura is something that helps to remove your personal information from data brokers and people search sites that will go and sell your info to identity thieves, scammers, and more. Aura goes and monitors your personal data, including your social security number, across billions of different data points like the dark web and public court records to alert you about potential identity theft. Aura is something that can protect you from financial fraud. It serves as a VPN. It provides antivirus services as it can protect your PC, your Mac, and Android from varying different malware. It serves as a password manager where you can store and access your online passwords securely. And you can get all of the things that I've listed here on one app at one affordable price. I use Aura to protect my family when inevitably we will get caught up in some kind of major hacking scandal again, because Lord knows there's been enough of that in the last year or so at this point. And if you don't want your family to be vulnerable when that inevitably happens, then by all means go and click my link down in the description. You can either do that or go to aura.com/historyofeverything and get 2 weeks free on services for Aura. That will be enough time to know whether or not your data has actually been exposed and you can do something about it, even if you only want to just try it out. Thank you, Aura, for sponsoring this video, and now back to the show. Now, when I go and say that we are going to tell the story of Canada, we are not going to be going all the way back to the foundation of Canada for this video, as that is a significantly less relevant issue for this topic today, but there are a few key points that need to be mentioned so that people understand what kind of position Canada is in, both the good and the bad, and this is something that sets the standard for what Canada has become today. Canada is the second largest country in the world, at least in terms of land area after Russia, occupying roughly the northern 2/5 of the continent of North America. Yet, despite Canada's great size, it is simultaneously one of the world's most sparsely populated countries, and has been that way going all the way back to its initial settling by Europeans, and even before that with varying different native tribes, as even with plentiful game and land, that simultaneously does not mean that there is necessarily all that much arable land in order to produce a consistent food supply. That, of course, would change later on with the development of modern farming techniques, but that is a story for a whole other time. In fact, when I go and describe this, Canada was not even united as one entity, let alone country, until the year 1867. Prior to that, sections of it were ruled by separate colonial governments. Canada's economic development in colonial times was based off the economic policy of mercantilism. This economic idea sought to derive the maximum material benefit from the colony for the homeland, with the most resources and wealth being transferred from the colony specifically to Britain, with a minimum of imperial investment into the colony itself. It was more so extraction based. This means that for centuries, the primary economic activity in Canada was based off extraction. Fish, timber, fur, minerals, and much more were extracted from Canada and shipped back to Europe, especially Britain, which gave it an easy source of income, but simultaneously slowed Canada's industrial development in comparison to its Southern American neighbor. However, that being said, things would begin to change after 1867 as the new government that came into power sought to industrialize. The first Prime Minister of this new nation was John A. Macdonald, and he outlined what would be Canada's economic program for decades. This would be the national policy, a system of protective tariffs that would encourage the development of Canadian manufacturing instead of just buying from foreign powers like the United States or even shipping things in from Britain. This would be combined with great railway building projects such as the Canadian Pacific Railway in order to link the East with the West and the intercolonial railways that would link central Canada with Atlantic Canada. As these developments took place, the economy of the rest of the country would improve dramatically after the late 1890s. And from 1896 all the way until the year 1914, Canada had the world's fastest growing economy. This is something that was truly impressive. And along with this, Canada would play an extraordinarily large role in the First World War, especially considering just how small it was with its population. It sent over hundreds of thousands of troops and was also a major granary and arms producer for the Allied side. It is truly something that was powerful and would supercharge its economy during this time. This would lead to further booms on the prairies as wheat prices would skyrocket. The rest of the country would benefit from an increase in manufacturing. Of course, a war boom does not necessarily last forever, and the Great Depression of the 1930s would hit Canada particularly hard, even harder than the United States. But it would rebound spectacularly in World War II. After this, fast forward a bit of time, and in the 25 years after the war, there was an immense expansion in the Canadian economy. Unemployment remained low, and the end of wartime production was quickly turned over from military goods towards making consumer goods. Canada, along with many other developed nations, would firmly establish itself as a welfare state, and publicly funded healthcare, the Canada Pension Plan, and other programs were all established. The quality of life for Canadians across the country drastically improved, and during this period, with the fall of Britain as a global empire, the Canadian economy became significantly more closely integrated with the American one as tariff barriers would fall and trade agreements were signed. Now, much of this growth would come from the expansion of earlier established industry, such as steel, although new sources of minerals were part of the boom in the 1950s. Both manufacturing and extraction were drastically increased during this time, improving wealth standards. Labrador iron and newly discovered deposits of radium, petroleum, and natural gas gave Canada resources that prior to it only had in very small supplies, but now was remarkably wealthy. The thing is, although Canada was small in population, the resources that it had were vast, something that the state with time would become increasingly dependent on for revenue. Though when we go and describe this, it is different in comparison to what you would see with, say, oil states, which are typically dependent upon one product. The sheer amount of varying different products that Canada has and can produce is something that created a very strong base for itself. So it is here then, my friends, that we need to skip ahead by a number of years to Trudeau. And no, when I say that, we're not talking about Justin Trudeau, but rather his father, Pierre. You see, Pierre Trudeau, who was a strong federalist, was elected leader of the Liberals and led the party to a decisive victory in Canada and Quebec. Trudeau's rule was something that was highly personal. He was a very direct leader. His ideas were clear, he would make grand promises, and simultaneously, he was quite inflexible in his thinking. The way that he wanted something done, that is the way that it was going to be done. And never before had Canada been governed by a prime minister that was so confident that at times it bordered on being arrogant. Despite these issues, he was quite popular in the beginning. He would dominate the political history of Canada through most of the period from 1968 all the way until the early 1980s. The Trudeau government, following a policy of heavy public spending, would pursue economic growth based on government direction and deficit spending. The result of that, of course, then was a high tax burden for the average person and frequent budget deficits as they would continuously go over budget in order to be able to invest in more goods. Depending upon the circumstances of the time, this is not necessarily something that is inherently negative, and many positives can come from it. During Trudeau's years, the Canadian economy would come of age, sometimes despite what it was that the government was doing that could negatively affect it. Canada continued to be a major supplier of food and raw materials to the world during the boom decade of the 1970s. But the economy was not simply one that was based on extraction. The proportion of people employed in manufacturing and the value of the industry's exports was far greater than those of just simple produced foodstuffs. The Canadian economy was rapidly growing. And so it is here then, my friends, that we have to touch upon the first can of worms that no matter what it is that I say, people are going to get upset about it. Immigration. See, here's the thing, my friends. With the economy still rapidly expanding, Canadians did not always demonstrate sufficient mobility in order to be able to go and fill job requests in said regions. Many regions of Canada were sparsely populated, while others were arguably overpopulated and wealth concentrated there. In order to fill many entry-level positions around the country, additional labor was needed if there would be any hope of jobs actually developing within these areas. Due to these circumstances, in 1967, the Canadian government had introduced a points-based system, under which applicants were given preference if they knew either French, English, or both, were non-dependent adults, as in they were not too old to work, whether they already had prospective employment that was lined up in Canada, had relatives in the country who could support them if necessary, were interested in settling in the parts of Canada with the greatest need for workers, and were trained or educated in the fields that were in demand. This new legislation would prove to be a massively important element in attracting large numbers of immigrants from sources that typically in the past had been considered non-traditional. And when I say non-traditional, that simply means not European. And no, my friends, I'm not going to be going over the entirety of Canadian history and the varying different immigration movements. In the case of this video, there is only one that we really need to focus on. Immigration in Canada since the 1970s, or the fifth wave, mostly came from Asia. This was largely influenced in 1976 when the Immigration Act was revised and maintained as official government policy. From then on, Canada would increasingly become a more multi-ethnic country with substantial non-European populations. Now, I already know what the comment section will likely look like when I say that, but here's the thing. As long as social tensions did not get too bad and the economy kept rapidly expanding, this was not going to be a problem. After all, Canada needed more people in order to fuel its growth. Its native population growth simply was not enough. But we're going to get more into that later here, and it's at this point then that we need to skip forward by quite a bit of time, because I have no desire to turn this into a 3-hour documentary, and the sheer amount of political crap that happens over the course of this time period is insane. But I had to get through the 70s and the 80s because that is the origin of the start of the housing crisis for Canada that would tie in with all the economic problems that it has today. Because among all issues that Canadians are facing, housing is certainly the greatest, or I should say, worst thing. Depending upon where you get your information from, the actual cause of the housing crisis is going to vary, as many different political pundits are going to accuse the other side of being the cause. Up until the early 1990s, Canada had a strong system of social housing. But in 1993, the federal government would stop funding these programs and instead would largely turn towards the private market in order to be able to solve housing needs, with a focus on promoting private home ownership as the ultimate goal of Canadians. Now, when I go and describe this, that shift was built on two beliefs. One, that the private market would be able to provide housing more efficiently than the government, and that two, home ownership would create financial independence for Canadians, thus improving their quality of life. For the first decade or so, this most certainly was true. However, the reality in recent years hasn't exactly lived up to those expectations. Instead, as time went on, homes largely became financial assets, commodities to invest in rather than places where people would live. As more homes were bought and sold as investments, coupled with high rates of immigration that brought in more people than homes were being built, naturally prices soared, making homeownership out of reach for many people today. For clarification on what it is that I mean, there's a number of different statistics that we can go and explain. While ownership rates would rapidly rise between 1991 and 2011, at the same time, so did housing prices, by 142%. This, as you can imagine, would be a bit of a problem, as in order for someone to be able to afford a house then, it means that they would have to take a larger amount of debt on. And with time, household debt within Canada would spike as more people would take on mortgages that they could barely afford. The gap between home prices and wages is something that would only grow with time, pushing many Canadians into precarious financial situations. For those of you who have seen anything like this here before with other things that I have covered on my channel, yeah, this is going to bring us to the talking point that we always have to bring up in any Western country's history, the 2008 financial crisis and the housing bubble. For context, the global financial crisis that began in 2007 dragged much of the world economy into recession, and Canada was not spared from this. Although, when I go and say that, the effects on Canada were actually much milder than that within the United States and in Europe. Still, that being said, the Canadian recession of 2008 to 2009 was still severe enough to generate sharp declines in output and employment, and it also required significant responses by the Canadian government. As for how they fixed it, the immediate priority of policymakers in the United States and other countries was dealing with banks and other financial institutions that suddenly were worth basically nothing and crashing. Financial institutions played a very key intermediary role in the economy, and governments were forced to act to minimize the disruptions that were caused by bank failures. Banks that were large enough were considered too big to fail, and if they did, they would have to be bailed out. What is interesting to note when I go and describe this is that a number of different banks were very aware that they were too big to fail, which produced its own kind of problem, its own contradiction. They believed that eventually the government would have to save them, which in turn made a number of banks engage in riskier behavior. The thing is, though, that primarily was a problem with the United States. Although Canadian policymakers would have to deal with the Big Six chartered banks that would have to be bailed out, the National Bank of Canada, the Royal Bank of Canada, the Bank of Montreal, the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, the Bank of Nova Scotia, and the Toronto Dominion Bank, even with these banks being too big to fail, Canada's regulatory regime actually prevented them from engaging in nearly the same level of risky behavior that you had seen in the United States and other places. One of the key reasons for this is that Canada's banks were actually obliged to maintain lower debt-to-equity ratios than most of their counterparts abroad. For anyone who is curious, higher debt-to-equity ratio offers the possibility of higher profit rates, basically high risk, high reward. But if you have a bank that is not allowed to loan out nearly as much money, then that means that they are not going to be nearly as vulnerable when something negative happens to the economy. Their assets are more protected. After the 1985 collapse of the Northland Bank and the Canadian Commercial Bank, Canadian regulations were further tightened. Partially because of this stronger regulation environment, Canada's banks were not nearly at the same level of danger that other banks like within the United States were. Now, you may wonder, looking at this, okay, why have I gone through all this detail? How is that something that translates to housing and the cost of everything else getting so expensive and bad? Well, because when there is a bubble and it pops, while negative, this simultaneously can serve as a correction against severe speculation. In the United States, the housing market would completely crash, and afterwards it would take several years to recover. The price of homes would crater, and then subsequently this would allow many people in that time period to be able to afford a home if they had the cash. In Canada, yeah, there was a dip in housing prices, but it never crashed, more so flatlined for a bit. Home prices very quickly started to pick up again after the 2008 recession, especially in major markets like the Greater Toronto Area or Vancouver, the major developed cities of Canada. In Toronto, as just an example, prices would grow steadily before spiking significantly in 2015, increasing by 15% alone in 1 year. By March of 2017, home prices in the Greater Toronto Area were at their highest, up over 34% from the exact same month in the previous year. This, as you can imagine, was making things very quickly unaffordable for the local population, and in response to the rapid increase in prices, the Ontario government at the time would introduce the Fair Housing Plan, which contained 16 different measures that were designed to cool the housing market, including a 15% foreign buyer tax. For those that are curious about what it is that I mean, essentially, Canada became a very popular place in previous years for wealthy foreigners to be able to park their money in order to be able to save it. Many different countries around the world are, how should we put this, not exactly stable. And so for a wealthy foreigner with no real guarantee of what exactly is going to happen to their money or country in any given year, parking that money in a foreign place like Canada that is strong and stable with appreciating housing values means that an investment into property is something that could pay dividends in the long term and simultaneously serve as a great tax haven for the future. That plan did work to cool the housing market, at least for a time, and home sales would drop by 15% and prices would fall by 20% over the course of the year following the implementation of this legislation. That drop, however, was something that was only temporary. And so it is here, my friends, then, in the mid-2010s, that we must bring in Justin Trudeau. For context, even as an infant, Justin Trudeau was an individual that was known to world leaders. It seemed that from the very beginning that there was going to be some kind of political future. In fact, an interesting story is that Richard Nixon, former president of the United States, while attending a gala dinner with Pierre Trudeau, Justin's father, would say, and I quote, "Tonight we'll dispense with the formalities. I'd like to toast the future Prime Minister of Canada, to Justin Pierre Trudeau." It was a joke at the time, of course, considering that he was merely a child, but simultaneously, that would actually end up being a prediction for the future. Still, Trudeau didn't follow his father straight into politics. At the age of 28, he was working as a drama and French teacher in Vancouver when his father would die. Naturally, considering how just big of a political figure his father was, the funeral was going to be televised. During this, Trudeau would give a very emotional eulogy, something that would stir many people within the nation, and the Liberal Party that had been watching and attending this noticed that he had some pretty good potential as a leader. When you consider the factors that Trudeau had the political pedigree and looks to be able to get people's attention, with time and his speaking ability, he very quickly ran up the political ladder. As an individual, he never lacked any kind of confidence, and I have to say, when you go and look at some of the political stunts that he was pulling off in the very beginning, from the early 2010s going all the way into the mid-2010s, this guy kind of was like a young Trump almost in that sense, except from a different kind of political leaning. One of the events that he was able to put on was a 2012 televised charity boxing match. No one at the time expected him to beat his opponent, which was a conservative senator and former Navy reservist with a black belt in karate, but the young, strapping, muscular, handsome Justin Trudeau, with his big smile, did. And it was something that exploded his popularity. After the fight, he became a man that would be lauded for toughness, for strength, for honor, and courage, and very quickly be pushed into leadership of the Liberal Party of Canada. For the power brokers within the party, this narrative was simply something that was irresistible. We're talking about the heir to Canada's most iconic political family, taking his place to lead the Liberal Party back from the wild. And very quickly, that is exactly what he did. In the 2015 general election, Trudeau would deliver a decisive Liberal majority government victory, vaulting the party from third place in the government to a very strong first, with near absolute control. For a time, it seemed that Trudeau could do absolutely nothing wrong. With his charisma, with his smile, with his powerful speaking ability, Trudeau was someone who is truly a modern man of the age for Canada, and all of the things that we associate with social politics of the 2010s was embodied specifically within him. He was a self-declared feminist with a gender-balanced cabinet, and when asked why it is that his cabinet was gender-balanced, he replied, "Because it's 2015. He was a climate advocate, promising bold environmental action, and an internationalist that wanted to welcome refugees and help the world. He very quickly rose to worldwide prominence as a progressive icon. In fact, my friends, when I go and describe this, I can't say nearly every single thing that this guy did because it was a lot. And some of his government's early major victories and policies included passing laws to legalize voluntary assisted dying in 2016, legalizing recreational cannabis in 2018, and even negotiating the Canada-United States-Mexico trade agreement in 2018 heading into 2019. Along with these, Trudeau was seen by progressives as an individual who wanted to right the wrongs of the past. He would apologize to Indigenous Canadians for the country's history of abuse at residential schools, and simultaneously would welcome thousands of refugees during the crisis that would evolve out of the Syrian civil war. Of course, when I go and describe this, my friends, not every single thing is positive, and I do not want people to think that with what it is that I am saying right now, that this is something to where I am throwing my support behind him, or it is that I am saying anything necessarily to be against him. I am merely describing what it is that the perception of him was at the time. And his global success and popular image internationally was oftentimes something that was at odds with the political challenges that he was facing at home. Not every single thing domestically was good. There were a series of ethical scandals as well as luxury trips that he would take early on in his rule, which is something that would greatly put people off, especially as the latter 2010s began to demonstrate to the average Canadian just how far their quality of life was falling and in danger due to worsening cost of living. This, my friends, is something that I'm going to need to explain. You see, my friends, in 2003, the average Canadian's annual income was $35,937. In 2023, 20 years later, it was $62,636, which I'll say is a pretty decent increase of 74.3%. However, over that same period, the average home price in Canada would increase from $207,510 to $678,282, which is a 227% increase. For clarification, so that people understand what it is that I'm talking about, the average home price was about 5.8 times the average Canadian's earnings in 2003, which from the get-go is not great. In the United States, that is something that has been viewed rather negatively, especially in the past couple years, but it is still somewhat manageable. By 2023, it was 10.8 times. And for many popular cities, such as in Toronto, this ratio could be significantly worse, with a Canadian working there needing 15 to 20 times their income. Now, my friends, I want you to think about that here for a second, because I did an entire video on the American housing issue. In 2022, in the United States, the median sale price for a single-family home was 5.6 times higher than the median household income. America is not in a great position there, obviously, but in comparison to Canada, that is nothing. Australia is also simultaneously something that we will need to cover here in the future on that note, but we're not doing that yet. That needs to be an entire other video. Either way, it still brings up the question, how did it get that bad? Well, depending upon your political leanings, there are a variety of different answers. Mass immigration, as just an example, is one of the things that has been blamed for driving up demand. For context, one of the first and most notable changes under Trudeau's government was the increase in immigration targets. The Liberal Party had promised during the 2015 election campaign to boost immigration numbers, and they made good on that promise. This is something that most certainly happened. His government placed a strong emphasis on humanitarian immigration and refugee settlement to bring in people not necessarily for their skill, but in order to help them. In 2015, shortly after his election, the government prioritized the resettlement of Syrian refugees, with his party, the Liberals, pledging to bring in 25,000 of them to Canada by February of 2016, which was done. This was successfully achieved. The move not only showcased Canada's commitment to providing refuge for those that were fleeing war and violence, but it also signaled a broader commitment to human rights and international solidarity. This was arguably one of the peaks of Trudeau's popularity, at least internationally. Even at home, this was still a widely accepted move, as people were quite pro-immigration at this time. Following the Syrian refugee initiative, Canada would continue its resettlement efforts, with the country taking in refugees from other conflict zones, such as Afghanistan or parts of Africa. In fact, Trudeau's government would welcome in refugees from other regions, including Yazidis from Iraq and LGBTQ+ refugees from countries where they faced persecution. As time went on, this number would only increase. The government set a target of admitting 300,000 immigrants per year by 2017, which was an increase from the previous Conservative government target of around 260,000. That is something that not only was done and maintained, but even expanded upon to larger values. Now, hear me out when I say this. I am not framing this in a way that it is either positive or negative. I am not doing anything like that. I am merely providing the numbers, as the effect that immigration had on the cost of living in Canada is multifaceted, with this creating an intense debate in the country that is still raging to this day. On one hand, additional working age labor was needed to fill job vacancies and provide a tax base for an aging population, something that pretty much every Western country suffers from. More things being produced and services offered were then created by virtue of there being more workers. On the other hand, more people also meant a greater demand for everything that a person needs: food, energy, housing, and more. All of these things go up in price as there is less that is available. In the case of housing, well, the numbers are pretty obvious there. According to a study published by the Fraser Institute, between 1972 and 2022, Canada's population would increase by 1.9 people each year on average for every new home that was being built. And in this case, we're talking about single detached homes, townhouses, condos, not necessarily apartment buildings. More specifically, since 2016, the average would rise every single year, except for there being a dip in 2020 when everything shut down, from 2.3 people per home built to a peak in 2022 at 4.7 people, the highest number on record. In other words, the gap between the number of homes that were being produced and the number that was actually needed in order to house the population has never been so wide. This, as you can imagine, would cause a severe spike in demand, driving up prices. But while this was bad in the later 2010s, where things really hit the fan for Canada though, and the worst jump was seen, was after 2019 and the COVID-19 pandemic. That is something that would apply immense pressure to the cracks that had already been forming in Trudeau's Canada. You see, my friends, Trudeau led the Liberal Party to a narrow election victory in 2019, which is something that would allow his government to still maintain control, but pushed his party into a minority position, something that weakened its power. Shortly after the general election, life in Canada and the world as a whole was severely altered by the outbreak of COVID-19. By March of 2020, the World Health Organization would go and declare the outbreak a global pandemic. Canada would respond to the dramatic public health crisis better than a lot of other countries did, but it is still something that would have drastic negative effects. Although the federal government was slow in making people wear masks and social distancing, within days of the WHO's declaration, it did enact significant restrictions on travelers that were entering the country and very quickly attempted to try and mitigate the economic consequences of shutting down the country by providing monthly payments of $2,000 for those who became unemployed as a result of the shutdown of varying different businesses. However, that being said, because much of the policymaking in response to the pandemic was left to the provinces, success in containing it, as well as the severity of things, would vary depending upon the region. When I go and describe this, it is a bit of a mixed bag, and I know that there's going to be very strong opinions here in the comment section. The government's swift rollout of support programs is something that helped the economy through a generational crisis, although the issue was that the surge in government borrowing in order to pay for the emergency would push the national debt sharply higher, from around $700 billion in 2019 all the way to almost $1.2 trillion by 2022. In merely 5 years, they saw their debt double. After this, when inflation took off in 2021 and 2022, hitting a 4-decade high of 8.1% in June of 2022, high spending is something that severely damaged the credibility of the government as people saw the worth of their money evaporate. It didn't matter that the government was giving out $2,000 a month, that was very quickly disappearing as the value of that cash disappeared. Of course, when I say this, the government is not something that can be 100% blamed. Most economists think that the rise of inflation was something that was driven by a combination of different factors: global supply chain disruptions, shifting consumer spending patterns through the pandemic, as well as a surge in commodity prices following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. You cannot simply blame all of this on one thing like the government, and to do so would be extremely dishonest. But government support checks is something that only added to inflation. And, unfortunately, Trudeau and his cabinet were very slow to realize that inflation was a very big problem that they couldn't just leave to the Bank of Canada alone. His government, through this time period, would run very large deficits, long after the central bank began to raise interest rates in order to try and stop inflation. And guys, when I say that they hiked interest rates, I mean they hiked them from a stupidly low 0.25%, not even 1% mind you, 0.25% in March of 2022, all the way to 5% in the summer of 2023. This big of a jump, as you can probably guess, completely broke mortgages and lending practices within Canada. Now, let me go and put this into perspective for you so you understand just how severe this is. At the end of 2022, 25%, a quarter of Canadian mortgage holders, had variable rate mortgages. What this means is that their mortgage payment would change depending upon what the overall interest level is at any given time. Along with that, most mortgage loans in Canada are renegotiated every 5 years, meaning even if you have a low fixed rate from 2020 at the start of COVID, that will expire in 2025. How severe is that, you may wonder? Well, that would take a stupidly expensive average Canadian home valued at $707,000 Canadian or 492,000 USD. And yes, when I say that, that is actually the average cost. It is that bad. We are talking about a mortgage payment at 2.15% interest, like it was in 2021, of $2,892 Canadian, becoming $4,560 Canadian as soon as that interest hits 6.65%, as it would in 2024. As you can imagine, what would happen if your mortgage payment quite literally doubled because of interest? That hurt a lot of Canadians, and as it stands, is set to hurt even more as time goes on. My friends, when I go to describe this, that's not even looking at what happened with inflation of everything else. That is merely the cost of what happened with housing. Many provinces across Canada, over the course of 3 years, from 2021 to 2024, would see a near 30 to 40% increase in the cost of food and other basic items. This would push tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people that before had been able to live relatively comfortably within their means to near poverty. And a report from the Food Banks Canada released in 2023 would find that that year, in 2023, with the cost of living skyrocketing, food bank usage would rise to its highest level since the survey started in 1989. The annual Hunger Count report is something that is based on surveys that are sent to food security organizations, which track their usage in the month of March. That year, the report would find that nearly 2 million people, including people that were not just unemployed, but more employed people than ever, were using food banks in March of 2023 alone. We are talking about something that was a 32% increase from the same month the previous year, and a more than 78% increase than from March in 2019. That is not good. And as people suffered, you may wonder, what did they see from the government? Well, further pushes for immigration, as things became less and less affordable. As pandemic lockdowns had waned, the government would open the doors to temporary foreign workers and international students, leading to the fastest population growth since 1957. When I go and talk about this, the Trudeau government would argue over the years that high immigration is something that would boost economic growth by counterbalancing aging demographics and filling job vacancies. And when I say that, it is technically speaking true. High immigration did grow the economy GDP-wise, and it did help the country avoid a recession during the Bank of Canada's rate hiking cycle. But increasing the overall national GDP does not necessarily do anything for the average person. That is GDP per capita, and that is something that would see very, very little growth, especially as housing affordability was continuously eroded. This problem became so obvious as time went on that not even Trudeau could stand against it, with him eventually conceding that his government, quote, didn't get the balance quite right on immigration. As a result of this, in October of this past year, 2024, Trudeau would announce that Canada was going to reduce permanent migration by 21% in 2025, this being from 500,000 migrants down to 395,000. Which is a massive cut, mind you. But at this point, the writing was already on the wall for Trudeau, and what it spelled was T-R-U-M-P. Trump. When Trump had come into office in America promising to make it great again back in 2016, his relationship with Trudeau was oftentimes very contentious, to say the least. Steep tariffs imposed on Canadian aluminum and steel on the grounds of national security in 2018 is something that left Trudeau's government scrambling to try and figure out a new trade deal with the United States. This was eventually resolved when Canada would salvage the agreement in 2019 and would secure a lucrative partnership that is something that would help the economy through the COVID years. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the two got along, and by that, I mean not at all. As an example, there was a awkward hot mic moment at a NATO summit in that same year in 2019 after the negotiations, when Trudeau was caught on camera seemingly mocking Trump in a conversation with the UK Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson, as well as the French leader Emmanuel Macron, after discussing a sudden press conference that was held by the American president. In the video, Mr. Johnson asked Mr. Macron, "Oh, is that why you were late?" And Trudeau would interject, "He was late because he takes a 40-minute press conference off the top." As you can imagine, since this is Trump that we are talking about, and he is not an individual that would let things go, he would respond by calling Trudeau two-faced. But that being said, it wouldn't be too long after this that Trump would be booted out of office, and for Trudeau, this was probably a huge relief. However, that did not bring an end to the political issues that he faced at home, which is something that we've already discussed here with the whole COVID issue and the scandals. But now, with Trump returning to the White House and his goading of the Canadian PM in recent months, that is something that appears to have hastened Trudeau's fall. The president-elect has repeatedly vowed to enact a 25% tariff on Canada in response to what he alleges is a flow of illegal drugs into the United States. Canadian officials, including Trudeau, would go and meet with Trump at Mar-a-Lago in recent months in order to try and smooth things over. But there hasn't really been anything indicating that the president-elect is going to budge on the issue. As a result, when Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland resigned this last month, it was pretty much the final nail in the coffin of Trudeau. She had been a longtime ally of Trudeau, and she would say in her resignation letter that she and the Prime Minister had been at odds over the best path forward for the country and how to respond to the proposed tariffs. It really seemed that she did not believe that he would be able to handle Trump. Her departure, which, mind you, when we talk about this was just hours before she was supposed to be delivering an important economic update after Trump's re-election. This was something that was seen as an indictment of Trudeau's administration. He would not be able to handle the incoming president. And with few allies left and the opposition rising in the polls to unprecedented heights, Trudeau would be forced to resign. So it is then, my friends, that at this point, Canada now faces a very perilous moment. Trump's inauguration is just days away. And with threats of economically devastating tariffs hanging over the country, people are very uncertain as to what is going to happen next. Trudeau technically remains as a lame duck prime minister until it is that the Liberal government faces the near certain defeat that they are going to have to deal with in March, which will lead to a snap election that they will more than likely lose. A Conservative majority government under Poilievre will shift Canada's policy drastically, probably undoing much of what Trudeau and his progressive movement have done. As for what the result of this is going to be, we don't really know. In time, it is possible that history will remember Justin Trudeau very kindly. After all, he did quite a bit to reduce child poverty, he strengthened pensions, and he expanded healthcare in Canada. But at the same time, he is also going to be remembered as a leader who prioritized non-citizens and plunged the country into debt. A debt that, at the time that I'm making this, may possibly be much worse than any of us realized until a new administration comes into power and is able to figure out just how bad things actually were. What this means for the future? Again, who can really say? Only time will tell. But my friends, this has been Stakuyi with another History of Everything podcast YouTube episode. I appreciate all of you for watching. Thank you very much, and please remember to like, comment, subscribe. Go and check out my Patreon in order to support me further if you can. And if you really want to do something fun, go and check out my shirts, which I'm actually not wearing one of those right now because they are all literally in the wash. But I am getting rid of 2 of my shirts if I haven't done so already by the time that this goes out. I am getting rid of the More Money, More Problems, which is inflation, which is really fitting for what it is that we're doing in Canada here right now. And I'm going to be getting rid of the Toyota Hilux shirt. There will be a couple more shirts that are going to be coming into play, and so when those come out, I will most certainly announce them. But until then, I will see you all later, my friends. Goodbye, and have a good rest of your day.